If we start even before we got to the Sustainable Development Goals, the notion of development itself has changed tremendously over time, over the last 50 years. In the 60, 70 years ago, if you were talking about development, people just thought you were talking about income or GDP per capita, how much money people are making, right? But we have come to recognize that development is broader than this. It's health, it's education, is inequality, is women's status, it's peace, etc., etc. So it's all this. Well, the population is a key factor in sustainable development, because the goal of sustainable development is really to achieve the greatest good possible for most people, while at the same time preserving the environment.
In the face of escalating global division and uncertainty, the 54th World Economic Forum kicked off its annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland on January 15th. With the theme of rebuilding trust, the forum aims at enhancing cooperation and cultivating partnership over the countries. The forum has assembled leaders from all over the world for a week of dialogues to discuss ways to deal with the challenges the world is facing nowadays, and showcases the latest proposal on global security, trade, economic growth, jobs, and so on. Among various global challenges, demographic problems have always been paid attention to. According to data released by Chinese National Bureau of Statistics on January 17th, the population aged 60 and above in China was more than 296 million, accounting for 21.1% of the total population in 2023. Facing aging population and other demographic problems, how can countries achieve sustainable development in the future? We are delighted to welcome Parfit Ilando, professor in the Department of Development Sociology at Cornell University, to our discussion.
My name is Eli Yang. I'm the reporter from SFC, and today it's my great pleasure to have you here, Professor Parfit Ilando.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So from your perspective, what are the main demographic challenges faced by different regions nowadays?
Well, in the world, if you wanted to describe the current situation in one single word, the word is diversity. If you look across the world, and if you look towards 2050 or 2010, you have really very different situations, depending on whether you look at the poorest countries of the world or countries that are a little bit more advanced economically. Among countries that are the 46 least developed countries in the world, population is really growing. It's going to double between now and 2050. And so the problem that poses is you're going to have a hard time meeting the basic needs, but also meeting the goals of sustainable development. So that's at the low end of the spectrum. Now, countries that are more advanced economically have almost the opposite problem. They're going to peak in their population before the turn of the century, and population is going to start declining. And so these countries have to contend with aging population and declining population size, and basically they have to address all the issues that have to do with aging population, pension systems, health and retirement system, etc. So each side has a different problem, and it's really a very different set of problems. Now, in addition to population growth, you have other questions that have to do with immigration, with health and pandemics, etc., etc.
So could you further discuss how could the population problems connect to the global sustainable development?
Well, the population is a key factor in sustainable development, because the goal of sustainable development is really to achieve the greatest good possible for most people, while at the same time preserving the environment. And so the population element is at the center, because we really need to feed and house and clothe all the people. And the more people we need to feed and clothe, well, the greater the challenge is going to be. But at the same time, people are also a resource. People are the ones that are producing these resources. So people are both a resource and a demand and a potential problem. And so finding the right balance, finding the right mix of providing resources that are feeding everybody is a challenge. on a global scale, you have to make sure that countries that are rich have enough people to sustain them, and countries that are poor don't have too many that they cannot feed. But even within the same country, you have to, if you look at the life stage, we all have stages in our lives, and we are productive, and stages where we depend on other people. So you have to manage the balance between the number of years when you're going to school, you're not productive, you depend on other people, and the time when you're retired. And so that balance needs to be achieved as well. So finding the right balance in population is really key in achieving sustainable development. It can be an asset, but it's also not close to a burden that we need to address.
Okay, so I learned that you had a lot of teaching experience before.
Yes.
For youth employment and education, what intervention or policy do you consider as the most effective to promote the youth employment in particularly developing countries?
Yes, you can think about solutions in the short term, immediate term. And here, government can intervene by creating employment schemes. You may have a major public works project, then you can hire a lot of youth. You can also provide incentives for businesses, provide subsidies for businesses so they can hire more. You can also provide, income relief for people who are unemployed. You can stimulate and encourage self-employment, people to find a personal job. You can improve the information system and the communication between job seekers and those who need demand in case there's a mismatch. So this is really for the short term. But for the long term, an economy has to maintain a balance between population, how many babies are born, how they go through the school system, and what the labor market can support. And so you need to have a balance and equilibrium in that entire system. If it gets out of balance, you're going to keep having a problem, and you have to keep finding emergency solution. So the long-term solution is just try to get that system to be stabilized by controlling the dynamics of population, paying attention to the quality of training that students get in the school so that it's responsive to the needs of the labor market, but also creating avenues for employment and making sure that economic growth is widely shared, that as the economy grows, you still have opportunities to employ large numbers of people.
Okay, so for a bigger scale, how does the local context influence the education sustainable development? It's also related to the long-term effort you have mentioned.
Right. The local context, there are many details in regulating that entire system. You have to really consider regional inequality within each country. You have different cultures and readiness to participate in the education system. You have to consider gender equality, which is, again, a thing that is very much in flux. In many countries in the world, you used to have girls not having access to education, and so you need to address this. But the trend is being corrected, and in some countries, actually, you're going to have the flip side of the equation happening. You have to make sure, as I said before, that the quality of education is consistent with the skills that are needed in the labor market. You have to make sure that there's a little bit of balance between the payoff of education, the money you invest in education to go through college and so forth, has to be, to some extent, paid back. Getting a good education should be rewarded in the labor market so that people have an incentive to train and to train hard in the fields that are demanded in the labor market.
I know that you used to be a member of drafting the first quadrennial report on sustainable development goals.
Yes.
From your perspective, how has the focus of the sustainable development goals maintained or shifted over time?
The focus, if we start even before we got to the sustainable development goals, the notion of development itself has changed tremendously over time, over the last 50 years. 60, 70 years ago, if you were talking about development, people just thought you were talking about income or GDP per capita, how much money people are making, right? But we have come to recognize that development is broader than this. It's health, it's education, is inequality, is women's status, it's peace, etc., etc. So it's all these things, and that's how we got to Sustainable Development Goal with 17 goals. But having gotten there, we have realized that focusing on 17 goals may be a little overwhelming. And so there's a tendency to really draw attention to three big areas. The income area, which is the economic area, the social area, which is inequality, and the environmental area, which is preserving the environment. But most importantly, because the world has realized that the area in which we haven't made a lot of progress is really the environment first and inequality second. And so this is why currently the focus seems to be very heavily on the environment and on inequality. And
the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
So are you optimistic with our accomplishment so far?
Yeah, it's both. I'm optimistic in the sense that there's greater awareness of the urgency that we need to address the problem of the environment, but that has to be followed by action. It's not enough to be aware that there's a problem. We have to realize that we can do something about it, and we have to be willing to do something about it. So from by nature, I tend to be optimistic. As I look at the work and the energy of people who are working on the front line of addressing these questions, at the UN, in countries, and civil society organization, there's reason to be optimistic. But it's also true that there's always a lot of inertia in getting people to change. People do not change as fast as you'd like. There's the weight of tradition. There's sometimes a tendency to assume that somebody else is going to take care of the problem and I don't have to change, right? It's somebody else's problem to solve. And so that inertia is one reason why, one may not be as optimistic as we would like.
Okay, so last but not least, for our individual scale, because many people nowadays in different countries or young men, when they cannot find a job after graduation, they will be anxious and scared. Do you have any advice for these people who can not immediately find a job? What can they do and how then they can think in their mind?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question because it's a question that I'm working on personally. I'm working with youth, trying to help them navigate that time between school and work, because it's also a time when you move from being young to being an adult. So it's really a delicate moment. My answer is finding work is the narrow objective. The broader objective is also finding yourself and finding the contribution that you're going to make to society. What I would say, not necessarily in the immediate term, is even before people complete their education, they have to be thinking constantly about the difference that they're going to make in the world. What kind of job do they want and why? What are they good at? And if you get your ideal job, how is that going to change the world besides giving you a paycheck? Mm-hmm. The closer you are to studying and to working in an area that you enjoy, that you're passionate about, that you have a comparative advantage of, that you have skills for, the easier it is going to be to get a job, and the easier it's going to be to excel at that job and be fulfilled in that job, right? And so the not totally helpful answer to your question is that I think even as it's a time of profound despair for many youth, keep trying to find yourself and say, okay, well, let's take this moment of job search as an opportunity and to think about, what would be my ideal job? How do I create that ideal job? How do I make the world better through my work in that particular area? And it's been my experience as an educator that everybody has a talent. Everybody has a genius, but sometimes it happens that too often, especially in countries that are relatively poor, you have people who work in areas that happen to be the area where they found a job. That's not what they were meant for. You may have a kid who is perhaps a great artist or a great pianist, and then they end up being an accountant. Right? They're going to get a job, but I don't think they're going to be the best version of themselves. Right? My answer would then be think big, think beyond, think of the job not as an end, but as a mean to be fulfilled and to make a difference in the world.
Thank you so much for providing useful advice for young men, and thank you for accepting our interview today.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.